I just wanted to offer a brief introduction to Mark. I've spoken about him several times over the last few days. I asked you earlier if people had inherited their teams or if they had a chance to choose who would be on their team. And Mark's someone I would choose to have on my team, pretty much any team, because he's an exceptional person, first and foremost, and a wonderful Jesuit. And he happens to serve as my spiritual director, so I really am especially grateful. Mark does not like to be the center of attention either. So I'm going to say these things while he's back there. I think he's one of the most talented and self-effacing people I know. And I find Mark's ability as a listener and discerner exceptional. And I've been blessed with some amazing spiritual directors in my life. But as you know, this past year was not easy for me, and Mark accompanied me in a way that he modeled in the one-to-one relationship what he will actually here demonstrate in terms of how groups and organizations can operate. An exquisite culture of listening, perception, and listening deeply into the interior movement of the Spirit, and then following that movement into action. Amazing. Mark comes to us with a variety of backgrounds and experiences. Believe it or not, before he entered the Society of Jesus, he was an IT engineer in Silicon Valley. And then went into the world of philosophy, and then eventually, after joining the Society of Jesus, became an educator at several universities, and in particular at Santa Clara, but working in South America, in El Salvador, and in the Philippines. In all of these things, I think Mark has developed some extraordinary skills for working with groups. So I'm so glad he didn't hear any of those things, because he would probably be embarrassed. But our hope with Mark today is that you find this a deeply personalized experience, and one that also translates in a very practical way to your organizations, right? And so Mark has developed a really beautiful program for us for this afternoon. He'll be with us for these 2 sessions. Please join me in welcoming Mark Ravizza.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you all. I apologize for the confusion. It's just I have a presentation to show you, and I'm going to be clicking through some slides, and I can't quite see them from behind me, so I hope that they will stay in sync. Sometimes I become too excited when I'm speaking about this material, and in my poor Californian English, people can't understand me. So if that happens, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and slow me down. Or if there's something that's unclear, stop me at any point, because this is our time. I want to speak about discernment in common, and in particular, creating the cultures and habits of a discerning community. Now, I suspect we all have a sense of what it is to do a discernment in common. How important it is to have the question be well defined, what exactly it is that we're discerning, to get the right people involved, to collect data that can inform our discernment. And then most importantly, to really take time to pray, to listen to the Spirit, and then to have a method to share the fruits of our individual prayer with a community. And I'll be talking about one method to do that today. There are many. And then finally, there needs to be clarity about who will make the final decision. Is it going to be the group itself reaching a kind of consensus? Will it be a superior? But it's important to lay all of that out in advance. I suspect for many of us, this is old news. And it really represents the kind of ideal. In the picture you see Father John Dardis doing a discernment about forming one congregation out of two. But there is a danger, I think, in this image of discernment and comment. And it's this: that we can think of discernment as a special technique or a stand-alone process. We imagine that it's only done by holy participants in a kind of ideal setting. It's not for us. It's not for daily business. And as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of a quote by the novelist Annie Dillard. She says, "A blur of romance clings to notions of discernment and common and Ignatius and his companions, as though, of course, God should reveal himself, if at all, to these simple people, these Sunday school watercolor figures, not to us, because we are various, complex, full at heart. We are busy." But she goes on. "So I see now were they. Who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord, or who shall stand in God's holy place? There is no one but us. There is no one to send, nor a clean hand, nor a pure heart on the face of the earth, but only us, a generation comforting ourselves with the notion that we've come at an awkward time, and we ourselves feel unfit, not yet ready. But there is no one but us, and there never has been." The message I want to give you is you are no more busy than Ignatius and his first companions were. No more busy than Pope Francis. No more busy than all those ideal people we think about. And there's no one but us if we're going to change the church and do this work of becoming a discerning community. So what I want to do this afternoon is to talk with you about discernment and common for us ordinary people who feel unfit, unholy, unworthy, and too busy. And I'm going to do that in a couple ways. First, I want to remind you that discernment and common is not just a standalone process used at special moments by holy people in an ideal setting. It's part of what I hope becomes an everyday way of proceeding at all of your institutions, congregations, religious orders. And the key point I want to make is to have you ask yourself, how do we as leaders foster the structures, processes, habits, and culture that enable us as a community consistently to listen and be guided by the Spirit? Let me repeat that. This is my key question. How do we as leaders foster structures, processes, habits, and culture that enable us to become a community that consistently listens and is guided by the Spirit? I first really started thinking about this years ago, and I was working in Manila in the Philippines. And I was working with a program that was kind of lay Jesuit run, that was bringing very poor Filipino scholarship students to live with North American students. They were inserted in very humble, poor communities, and they were integrating their academic learning with this direct contact with reality. It was an amazing place to teach. But one of the things that was both challenging and transformative about it is that in that kind of context, everything always goes wrong. You know that joke, you want to make God laugh, tell God your plans. We felt that daily. It would be a typhoon, something wouldn't happen, someone would die, something would happen in the community, teachers wouldn't show up. And so what began to happen is we had to constantly change our plans. And as we had to change our plans, we began to notice, are we reacting to things? Or are we being proactive in taking advantage of opportunities? And little by little, our culture began to change. When we first went there, on Monday morning, we would do a check-in with the staff at our meeting. So we'd have a little check-in about how we all were doing. It would take about 20 minutes and we were done. By the time I left, our Monday morning check-in had become the entire morning. And people would come down and they'd say, how can you spend a whole morning doing this discernment together? And we would say, if we don't do this, the rest of the week will go off the rails. Why? Because we would spend the whole morning, number one, checking in on where we were as a staff, going through all of our students, getting a sense of where they were, what's happening in our communities, what's the Spirit doing here, and out of that would come our plans for the week. And then as the plans for the week would change, we would have to come back and pray together and kind of say, where is the Spirit leading us? And we developed other routines, like we would have a weekly liturgy that was initially just for the staff, but soon we began to invite all of our students to that. And the homily changed from me talking to us doing a shared homily, because we found it was a way for all of us to listen to where the Spirit was moving. And what began to happen is every time things went wrong, we didn't say, oh my goodness. We said, thank God. Because somehow this is another little window, a moment for grace to work. So I'd like you to think about, what are the structures, the processes, the habits that can create a culture of discernment in your organization? And to kind of help you think about this, I'm going to go through a case study this afternoon. It was one that I became involved in with revising Jesuit intellectual formation in North America. And I'm going to kind of talk about three parts. So one, how we launched the project and some of the structures we had to adjust. Secondly, how we used spiritual conversation as a process in this revision. And thirdly, I want to talk about one moment where we reached a key decision, where we had a kind of discernment in common. Launching the project. When I was first beginning this project, I was still in Manila, and I was supposed to have a conference call with all of the provincials in North America. And it was an absolute disaster. I don't know if during the pandemic you had this experience, but you're on a Zoom call, you can't connect, the video keeps going on and off. And so I was trying to talk with these people, and we kept losing the connection, and they were trying to explain to me what they wanted, and I was trying to ask questions. And at the end, I was completely in desolation. What do I mean by that? My interior sense was one of hopelessness. I was feeling that God's not involved in this. It felt so different than the community that I was working with every day. And so I went to prayer, and I actually went to my community there in Manila. I said, I just had this terrible experience. This is what I'm feeling. I'm feeling no hope. I'm feeling a lack of God. I'm feeling these provincials just have a to-do on their to-do list, and I'm it. And they just want to check me off and get on to the next thing. And so we talked and we prayed about what's going on. And what struck me was there was no shared inspiration in this group. Revising our formation was something they were doing because the general of the Jesuits had asked them to do it. They lacked a dream. They lacked a sense of, this can really make a difference. And without a dream, there's no discernment. Without a dream, there's no inspiration. Without a shared sense that this really matters, you can't face any obstacles. And behind every dream is a story. And so when I discerned with my little group there in Manila, what they said is, when you get a chance to go back and talk to those folks in person, you have to hear their stories. And you have to help them recover the dream behind this project. So when I went, we were in a group, and I asked everyone to share stories of their own formation. What had moved them? And to share stories of how they saw formation now, and to dream together about what this project could become. And it was amazing, because as soon as we began to share stories, to talk about our own lives, and to remember what a difference this can make, and as soon as we began to imagine together that things could change, the blue sky opened up. I remember one guy saying, it's just been like this and we can't change. And I remember this was so hard in my formation and it's still hard in formation. And I said to him, but there's a difference now. He said, what's that? I said, we can change it. We can make a difference. And so they began to imagine not just doing a program review. They said, let's dream and imagine a completely bold renewal that completely forms Jesuits for our mission to the contemporary world. It was amazing. But then, I began to see the culture that those poor provincials operated in. And I began to understand why they lost their inspiration so quickly. Because it was so much different than the context I was coming from in the Philippines. What did it look like? It looked very much like this picture. When they gathered for their meetings, they were in a boardroom. They would begin with a perfunctory prayer, something they said at the beginning, and then that was the end of God. Was not integrated into their work or into their meeting. They had a busy agenda without any time for silence, reflection, or depth. When I first went to their meetings, they had, those board books, and they would flip through formation from 2 to 4, sexual abuse, 4 to 6, and you can imagine. Exhausting. They spoke like a group of individuals, each province represented by its provincial. They were not a discerning body. And their conversation was like a set of intersecting monologues. Each person made a point, somebody else made another point, somebody else made another point, but I was like, I don't think we're going very deep. And is anyone listening to anybody else? So as I watched that, I said, however they operate in their realm, on my project, we have to change this culture. We have to change from a corporate culture to a discerning culture. What does that mean? First, we had to integrate prayer into the meeting, both as input and as process. And we'll talk about how to do that. Secondly, we had to change the agenda. When we were going to talk about this formation project, we wanted to have less topics, and we wanted to be able to return to the same topic, the same conversation over multiple days to give the Spirit a chance to speak and for us to listen and for the conversation to deepen. Thirdly, we had to create a discerning body. And we did that by beginning to practice this spiritual conversation that I was doing down in Manila. And lastly, the kinds of conversations we were having had to change. Instead of being like a ping pong game where monologues were bouncing off against one another, we had to create a kind of shared clearing, a shared space where we collectively could listen to the Spirit. Now, key to this is what I want to talk about next, a process to help affect this change in culture. I suspect all of us, in some ways, have been involved in spiritual conversation. I want to talk about one way to do that with you this afternoon. But first, I want to have us think a little bit about the dynamics of a conversation, the structure. How do we listen to one another? And where is our attention? Often, as I said, our conversations are like intersecting monologues. I don't know if any of you have been to these sorts of dinner parties or these sorts of business meetings where it just seems like whatever Gabriela says, it's just an opportunity to remind me of the story I really want to tell you. Right? And if Mario says something, it's just a cue for me to make the point I want to make. My focus on these kinds of conversations is on myself. I'm thinking about what do I think, how do I judge the other person, what point do I want to make, how do I defend my territory, how do I influence the group. Not a bad way to have a conversation. Sometimes you need to have that kind of conversation, but it's not the only way to have a conversation. I'm going to play you a clip from a film about Ignatius. This sounds a little tough. So I'm going to tell you a bit what you're going to see. So this is a moment where Ignatius has just experienced his sort of cannonball moment. He's been injured, and he's beginning to imagine that he could lead a different sort of life. And his brothers are very worried about him, so they decide to take him to a brothel to kind of have him lose this religiosity. And he ends up talking to a woman that he's actually slept with before, but he can't remember her. And you'll just watch the conversation. And maybe you can dim the lights.
Please, please. I do not wish to.
Are you all right, my lord?
Let us just, please, just sit and be quiet, all right? Let my brothers finish and then we can leave. I'll pay you the same.
As you wish, my lord.
So you've been doing this long?
Long enough. You were my third customer back in the day, my lord, if you remember.
And do they treat you well here?
Better than at home, I can't complain.
At home?
My father was a drunkard, my mother was a slut. They beat me, both of them. I have forgotten most of it.
I'm sorry about that. It must have been hard.
It got better after my father died. When I moved here, I had nothing on my feet. Now I have a bit of money saved. I make dresses.
You made this dress?
Yes.
It's beautiful.
Thank you. One day I'll go off and become a seamstress or something. Something respectable. It's my dream.
And why not now?
Why not now?
Yes?
Yeah, why not now?
Are you all right?
Yes, my lord. Sorry.
Well, don't be sorry.
You are the first person I have spoken to in a long time that does not want me to get naked and then leave. I don't know if I can live this life.
Has to work at a brothel because she's so poor, but she tells Ignatius, I'd like to be a dressmaker, and I make my own dresses. And Ignatius begins to get drawn into this conversation with another person. But we also see his own sense of privilege. Like when she says, oh, I'd like to be a dressmaker, and he says, well, why not now? Why don't you do it now? Because of course Ignatius, he could do it. He could leave. He could try a new life, but this poor woman can't. And yet when he sees her tears because he's listening to her, he begins to sense how he's made a misstep, and they begin to go deeper. Now, this is a kind of shared dialogue. Notice where our attention is. That's not on me, what I'm thinking. Ignatius and this young woman get drawn into listening to one another. The focus is on being present and available to what's being shared, and to let that challenge us and revise us. And oftentimes when we talk about spiritual conversation, because in some sense it's a spiritual conversation, we have that as an imagination, a shared dialogue. But what I want to tell you is that is not what we want to mean by spiritual conversation. There's something more. And to illustrate the more, I want to show you the next clip in the film. What's going to happen, it's a little bit, as we would say in California, cheesy, sentimental. But Ignatius is trying to help this woman listen to God. And so he says, see if you can imagine in this empty chair that our Lord is present. And listen to the Lord. What might he say to you? And I want you to watch what happens.
He's looking at me. And he's smiling. A very kind smile. And he's looking at me like he's been doing it for all my life.
And what is he saying to you?
That he understands me. That he loves me. That he does not care where I've been, he just cares where I'm going.
Now that's a spiritual conversation. In some sense, if you look at what they're doing, it's a kind of receptive, what I would call a trialogue. That there's three people involved in the conversation. And Ignatius and this young woman are collectively trying to listen to what is that larger spirit saying through her. And she has these beautiful things she says. I feel as if he's known me for quite a while. Right? And he's saying that it doesn't matter what you've done, it just matters where we can go together. And it's great in the film. You see both Ignatius and this woman looking together at the Spirit. Imagine if you could do that in your community. Imagine what can happen when we collectively listen in that way. What we have to do is we have to listen both to what's being said and to that larger spirit that's speaking through our words. I remember when I was first learning how to do spiritual direction, and someone said, when you're listening to the person in spiritual accompaniment, listen to the person, but also pray. And at first I thought, how can I listen to the person and pray? But what they meant is pray in the sense of awareness of the Lord that's present. And how do we hear the Lord speaking? We hear the Lord speaking through our interior movements. For Ignatius, that's one of the clearest ways that the Holy Spirit works. And I hope you all know what I mean by this sense of movements or motions. You ever notice like you're listening to someone, like maybe you're listening to that, and you just feel like, this is the moment of hope. Or someone can be talking, and all of a sudden they'll say, and you feel like, this is important. You feel a sense of peace, maybe, or a sense of excitement, a sense of what we would call consolation, of moving closer to God. And you also probably know that feeling of you're talking to somebody and you just feel like it's going the wrong way. I'm getting depressed. We're not connecting. We're heading in the wrong direction. And so Ignatius says, pay attention as you listen to somebody, not just to what they're saying, but also how it's moving you. Because often how it's moving you is also how it's moving them. You can feel their energy. You can feel their consolation. That larger life and freedom that's trying to speak. In my experience, our God always wants two things. More life and more freedom. It's always about that. And how is God trying to bring more life and more freedom into this room? You see it with this young woman very clearly. So as we listen to one another in a community, we want to create this kind of receptive space. We want to create, Heidegger uses this language of a clearing. We want to create a space, a clearing, into which some new life, some new energy, some new hope can be disclosed. To give you a sense of what this feels like, I want to share a wonderful quote from the philosopher John O'Donohue, who's talking about great conversations. Just listen to what he says.
The question is, when is the last time that you had a great conversation? A conversation which wasn't just two intersecting monologues, which is what passive conversation was in this culture. But when had you last a great conversation in which you overheard yourself saying things that you never knew you knew, that you heard yourself receiving from somebody words that absolutely found places within you that you thought you had lost, and a sense of an inventive conversation that brought the two of you onto a different plane, and then fourthly, a conversation that continued to sing in your mind for weeks afterwards, you know? And I've had some of them recently, and it's just absolutely amazing. They're, like as we say at home, they're food and drink for the soul, you know?
I so wish I could speak with that kind of accent. Everything he says just sounds so much more profound. But he says some profound things. Look at the four things he says that are very clear marks of the Spirit. He says, I'm having this conversation and it's not intersecting monologues. Rather, a great conversation is one in which you overhear yourself saying things you never knew you knew. Have you all had that experience? Like you say something and you think, that's not me. It's the Spirit that's speaking. And then he goes on and he says that you heard yourself receiving from somebody words that absolutely found places within you that you thought you had lost. Have you had that experience? Somebody says something and you're like, oh, yes. Right? Again, it's that sense of the Spirit reminding you, speaking to you. And then it brings us to a different plane. And I love this line. It continues to sing in your mind for weeks afterwards. That's why when we create these processes, like I did with the provincials, you can't rush. Because if you have these conversations, you have to let them sing afterwards. Let them sing into the coffee break. Let them sing before you go to sleep. Listen to those lost places speaking to you. And that's what you want to come back and share. So the question I want to leave with you, as you think about this is this only something that happens rarely? I want to say no. I think we can be intentional, strategic, and deliberative about creating these conversations in our places of work and ministry. And how do we do that? There's a very simple technique I'm going to talk with you about, spiritual conversation in rounds. It's one way to have conversation. I'm going to give you the ideal, and then we're going to talk about 1,000 different ways you can adapt as the afternoon goes on. The most important thing, I always tell people, is prayer. If you haven't prayed, you can't have a conversation where you talk about your prayer. So it's fundamental that when you are going to use this technique, that you schedule into your meetings time for prayer. You can always tell when someone comes to a spiritual conversation and they've been doing email during their prayer time. It's obvious. Because there's no depth, there's no energy, there's none of that sense of hope, of consolation, of peace. peace that we find when we pray. And then to take time to really journal and get ready for the conversation. Next, you go into a first round. And what we recommend doing is actually going person by person around the circle. So you don't have those long, embarrassing pauses. You ever have been in a group where you're sharing and it's like, is somebody finally going to share? And you just lose all kinds of time. So you just go person by person. And it's important to have a time. To share the fruit of your prayer, you should be able to do it in 3-4 minutes. And I didn't believe this until I saw a community one time, a formation community in Canada that had been practicing this. And we were actually talking about this formation revision. And the superior of the community said, well, we're going to do a spiritual conversation. And I had been doing this with the provincials. And I said, well, it's going to take us a couple hours. And he said, oh no, my men are well trained. They sat down, they all had 30 minutes of prayer. They came back and person by person, just because they had learned the discipline of knowing what to share, of moving to consolation. What you want to share is the fruit of your prayer. And we'll talk about how to figure out what that is. It's good in these cases oftentimes to have a little timekeeper, and not to interrupt the person, but just to say, if you start going over your 4 minutes, I'm going to gently gesture, and that tells you land the plane. So it's good to kind of set those rules up in advance. After the first round, take some time for silence. Listen, what moved me? And we'll talk a bit. And then you begin a second round. In the first round, we're talking about how was I consoled as an individual in my prayer. Each person shares their individual consolation. But the goal of round 2 is to move to communal consolation. So what I want to share in the second round is, as I listen to all of this, what moved me? Where did I feel the Spirit? And it might be that, Frank was talking, and when Frank said, we really need to be with the poor, I just felt like, yeah, I wish I had said that, right? And one of the things we learn is that our prayer that we have in that time before a spiritual conversation is never just for us alone. It's always for the community. That the Spirit's speaking to us and giving, it's almost like the Spirit's giving us different parts of the puzzle. Or giving, like Frank might say, I think we really need to be with the poor. And then I get to Ben and he goes, it's funny, in my prayer, I think we need to be with the poor. And that just resonates with me because I was thinking, yeah, we need to live simple. We need to be giving witness. So what you're doing in that second round is you're sharing, as I listen to all of this, this is what consoled me. This is what moved me. And then you have some silence. And you say, what is the Spirit saying? And I will tell you, one of the things I love about doing this is that we begin to see that the Spirit speaks through each person. One of the reasons for this kind of technique is that it ensures that everyone's voice is heard, that everyone matters. Have you ever been in one of these group discussions where the extroverts dominate? Or the person in power dominates? Where we can't get a word in edgewise because the bishop is talking on, or the priest, or the boss. So this is a kind of conversation that ensures that everyone matters, that everyone has a chance to speak, that everyone's heard. And then we move to a third round. In the third round, what we're doing is, this is where we're really trying to discern spirits. And we've learned in the church how to discern spirits individually. But to do this kind of discernment, we need to discern communally. And one of the things we're finding as the church is becoming more and more synodal is we really have to develop that art of reading the spirits in a group. I was in a conference call the other day with the provincials of North America, and we were planning a meeting, and we got sidetracked on this conversation that was about some boundary violations. And everybody was talking about this, and the meeting was going to become about this, and everything. And I noticed as I was listening to us on the Zoom call, everyone was getting distracted, impatient, impressed. And I had to step back from the Zoom call and just say, so what spirit is in the room here? And as soon as I did that, I felt, wait, the energy for me isn't talking about these incredible formation revisions that came out of what I'm talking to you now. And so I just said, it feels to me like the spirit has left the Zoom call. And we're suddenly talking about the whole meeting becoming about boundary violations, when I feel like the energy we have is about what we're doing in formation. And as soon as I said that, everyone said, absolutely. How did we get sucked into this place? That's what we have to learn how to do. Now, to do this kind of spiritual conversation, I want to kind of introduce you to two key skills. And when you introduce this to the people you work with, you'll have to share these key skills. They're easy. Speaking intentionally and listening contemplatively. Speaking intentionally. What you want to do is at the end of your prayer, you want to ask yourself, how was I moved? Where was the Lord? What consoled me? And we often say in Ignatian prayer, end your contemplation with a colloquy. So spend some time talking to the Lord. Ask him, hey, Jesus, what do you want me to say to the others? What really matters to you? What do I need to say? Try it out. He will tell you. I promise you. And that's what you want to journal about. Take some time to organize your thoughts so in a few moments you can say, this is really what I heard. Prepare it so you don't waste time. And the key, and this is the key, don't stay in your head. The Holy Spirit rarely spends all his time here. Loves to be here. Get in touch with what you felt and what moved you. And share what comes out of your prayer, not what you think you should say. You will be tempted sometimes to think, if I say that, people are going to think I'm crazy. I should say something that makes me sound erudite and smart and insightful. Don't give in to that temptation. Oftentimes, the crazier the thing is that comes up in your prayer, the wilder it seems, the sillier, the more the Spirit is speaking. Freeness, more life, more freedom. And the second thing that you want to do is to listen contemplatively. This is critical. How often have you been in a group and people are talking and everyone's looking at their phone, at their watch? There's poor Maria Luisa talking and what does that make you feel like when you're talking and nobody's looking at you? The power and the magic of really being present, creating that clearing, where you can listen and you say with your eyes and you say with your whole being, I have nothing to do, nowhere to be except here. To create that spaciousness in your heart where the other person can enter. Right? There's a difference between listening attentively and being available. You know that difference, right? Have you ever been to a doctor and he listens really attentively, he checks all your things, but you feel like he didn't really hear me? Versus when somebody's available, that sense of, oh my gosh, I can tell everything. I did a workshop one time with students where we just practiced this, and at the end, one young woman was in tears, and I said, oh my gosh, why are you crying? And she said, this is how I've longed to be listened to my whole life. Listen like that. The way you listen says to each person you matter. And listen not just with your head, not just to the content that's being said, but listen with your heart. What are you feeling? And pay attention to what moves you as you listen. Where do you feel consoled, energized, hopeful? That's what you want to share in the second round. Now, I want to talk, when you go into your small groups, about how can you make this work in your own experience. Because the key here is to see that this can be adapted. Sometimes, if you just want to get a sense of where a group is, you can just do 2 rounds. Sometimes you can say, all right, I just want to kind of do 1 round and we all kind of share. and then we'll take some time, and then we'll come back after a coffee break and do a second round. So you can adjust it. I'm going to give you time in your small groups, but I want you to begin to think about that as I run through a key question. When should we use spiritual conversation? So this is an important technique, but one of the things I find when people first learn it is they're so excited by it that they start having every meeting doing spiritual conversation. I remember in the Curia when we first, after this 36th General Congregation, and Father General was saying, we really want to discern in common and we want to be doing spiritual conversation. And it seemed like every single meeting we had would be like, okay, now we're going to pray, and now we're going to go have spiritual conversation. And we get into the spiritual conversation and say, I don't know if we really need to be doing this to look at the budget. So it's important to use this technique strategically. And let me give you an example of that. When I was doing this revision of formation, in our first phase, we wanted to do a collective listening and reflection on formation. So the first part is I did visits to all of the houses of studies, I did focus groups with professors, open dialogues with men in formation, structured interviews. We were doing a qualitative assessment. And based on that assessment, we then had another few months where we were doing a quantitative assessment. We took what we had heard in all of these focus groups. We created surveys for our men in formation, for the people that we serve. But right in the middle of that, we had a formation gathering. We had all of the men in formation. It was amazing. About 250 participants. And we wanted to say, we've been listening to them in focus groups, but what might the Spirit say? And somebody on my team said, what if we had them do spiritual conversation? And I said, with 250 people? He said, I think we should give God a chance. And so we said, why not? Let's see what happens. Which is a good thing to do when you're a leader. Let's see what happens. What's the worst that can happen? It doesn't work, and then you've learned, and you don't do it next time. Okay? So it was a sense of let's trust God. So we did spiritual conversation. What's the most important thing in a spiritual conversation? Prayer! Thank you, Lavendo, you were listening, right? Never forget prayer. Right? So you have to begin with prayer. So what we did is we said, okay, we're going to send all of these guys away for an hour of prayer. An hour of prayer. And I only had a morning with them. And we based the prayer that we gave them on a famous Ignatian contemplation on the Incarnation. I hope many of you know it. It begins by imagining the world in great need, seeing the Trinity gazing down on the world, and then sending the angel Gabriel to Mary to do something about this. Well, we took that very famous Ignatian prayer and we adapted it for the moment. What we did is we asked our men to imagine this world in great need, in their prayer to see the Trinity gazing down on the world, and then instead of having Gabriel come to the Virgin, we said, imagine you hearing Jesus, poor and humble, calling you to labor in the vineyard. It's a very Ignatian image from our constitutions. And the question that we gave them was this. Oh, I'm sorry. The question that we gave them was this. In your prayer, savor those moments when you have had a sense of being sent with your companions to labor in the vineyard, and contemplate how we've been prepared to do this. Consider how greatly the world stands in need of God's grace, and then with the Lord, imagine how we might improve our formation to better prepare ourselves for our mission in the future. Now, I share this example because sometimes in some spiritual conversations, it's important when you send people off to pray to really give them points. And other times it's not. It's one of the parts of the art that you as a leader will decide. Is it going to be too constrictive to give them? Is it going to be helpful to give them points? It's something to think about. In this case, we thought, we have 250 people. Let's have them all listen to the Spirit on the same thing. And so we sent them off it was in Los Angeles on this college campus, and I remember talking to this one student, and she said, "Father, this was the most inspiring moment of my life." And I said, "Why was that?" And she said, "To see 250 Jesuits praying for an hour in silence in chapels on the lawn." She said it was like heaven. It was amazing. And then they came back into 34 different groups, and they did spiritual conversation. And I had trained all of the facilitators. They did their 3 rounds, and at the end of the 3 rounds, we asked them, send in, write up your main points. And then I collected those. We didn't even have time to bring it all back to the plenary. But what was amazing was that the Spirit spoke so consistently and clearly. It was the most helpful moment of the entire phase 1. And what did we hear from the Spirit? That the men wanted studies more connected to the reality of the world, and they wanted more sustained contact with the poor. That they wanted a formation that was more rooted in Christ and cultivating our distinctive Jesuit mission. That they needed better integration between academic studies and apostolic experience and spiritual formation. They wanted a framework to really understand the contemporary reality that they were facing. And they needed a flexible formation that could adapt to individuals and really help them develop real-life skills for ministry, not just book learning. And they needed formation for a diverse, intercultural, global context. Now, what was amazing to me is these points highlighted things we had heard in the focus groups and things that we were seeing in the survey. But what these did is they cast into relief the most important points. It was as if suddenly Jesus was saying, these are the points to pay attention to. I'm going to break here, and what I'd like you to do is to break into your small groups. And before you start your conversation, maybe take some time for silence, a few minutes, and just journal about a question. You might write this down. How can I, as a leader, foster structures, processes, habits, and culture that enable my community to better listen and be guided by the Spirit? So just brainstorm for a moment. As you think about your context, what's one thing you might do to begin to develop this discerning community? And then, in your group, share one concrete strategy, challenge, or question that emerged during your journal. And notice you can have a question or a challenge. So you might, as you journal, end up saying, I think Mark's nuts. This will never work. That's fine too. But share that with your group. So we have about a half hour. So take that time and then you'll go to your break. I think, is that right? At 4?
Yes.
And then we'll come back here in an hour at 4:30?
Yes.
Yeah, so you should have plenty of time. And continue the conversation during your coffee break. I hope you all have conversations that sing, right? That speak to you. And let's just kind of see, what does the Spirit want to say to us as leaders about how we might develop this kind of community? Thanks very much.